have the people. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. This is the Carbon Research Program Policy Speaker Series, also known as part of the Carbon Monitoring System or CMS initiative. Before presenting today's speaker, I just wanted to make the reminder announcement that this week we were having the CMS Science Team Meeting and Applications Workshop in Scripps Seaside Forum in La Jolla, California, and that was postponed to November later this year. So for more information, you can visit the CMS website at carbon.nasa.gov. Also, I just wanted to announce that we are helping to organize and coordinate a joint workshop between the U.S. Forest Service and NASA, an applications workshop that is going to happen April 30 to May 2nd in the U.S. Forest Service Geospatial Technology and Applications Center in Salt Lake City. And there we will have the participation of CMS, JEDI, SMAP, ISAT-2, and NISAR missions. So that's something that is going to be of a lot of interest. If anyone is interested in attending, please, you have to submit a statement of interest by this Friday, February 15. And if you have any questions, just come and talk to me after the talk. So now I would like to welcome today's speaker, Dr. David Reidmiller. He's the Director of the National Climate Assessment within the U.S. Global Change Research Program. He is currently on detail from the Department of Interior's U.S. Geological Survey, and prior to joining the U.S. Global Change Research Program, David was the Chief Climate Scientist and the Lead Climate Technology Negotiator at the U.S. Department of State, where he coordinated the engagement of the U.S. in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he led U.S. negotiations related to science and technology in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and directed the Department of State's efforts in the U.S. Global Change Research Program. So for today's talk, Dr. Reidmiller will discuss the development process, the main messages, and some of the novel aspects of this fourth National Climate Assessment report, the Volume 2 on impact, risks, and adaptations in the United States, which, as you know, was just released in November of 2018. He will give particular importance, given the audience, to the topics of reducing the risk through emissions mitigation, the direction of future research, and other issues of relevance to the NASA carbon science community. And the talk and David's visit to go there intends to spur a discussion about remaining knowledge gaps and research needs for future assessment reports, as well as discuss the potential collaboration opportunities between the U.S. Global Change Research Program and the NASA carbon science community. So we'll have an opportunity for discussion and questions after the talk. And now, without further ado, I will leave you with David.
Thanks, Adil, and thanks to all of you for joining. I know some of you may have had a late start to your morning, so appreciate you finding the time to come in today. And for those of you joining us online, thanks for joining as well. Before I get started, I need to just thank the hundreds of people that not only wrote this assessment report, but also the hundreds, if not thousands more, who actually submitted comments and reviewed it. So many of you may be in the room, so thank you for your contributions in that sense. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank NASA's engagement in the U.S. Global Change Research Program, led by Jack Kay and Pat Jacoberger-Jellison, who served as the Federal Steering Committee member for the NCA. So I'll start with a little bit about the background and motivation for the National Climate Assessment, how it was developed this time around. You know, this is the fourth time we've done it, different ways each time. I'll then zoom out and look at an overview of the findings, basically walking through the overview of the report itself, before zooming in a little bit on just a couple of topics of relevance to this community. Obviously, this is a 30-chapter report. 1,500 pages. Not going to be able to give it the justice that it deserves here, but hopefully it'll spur a little bit of interest and help you guys dig in a little bit more detail. I'll then kind of zoom back out a little bit more to focus on some of the regional aspects. The idea here being that, as we'll talk about, the assessment this time around really pivoted to focus and emphasize regional and localized information. Since it is an impacts assessment, there was a big push to have that information featured quite prominently. And then I'll end giving a nod to the SOCR 2 report, which is the second State of the Carbon Cycle report, which came out, incidentally, the same day as the National Climate Assessment, and represents an enormous body of research that many of you probably contributed to or are aware of, and is probably even more relevant to this community at a more technical level. So, briefly, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, for those of you that don't know, actually started as a presidential initiative under Ronald Reagan back in 1989. It was signed into law unanimously the following year in 1990 in the Senate. And we were mandated to basically, at a broad level, assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to both human-induced and natural processes of global change. Within that law, as you'll see in a second, there are a number of requirements, but we are overseen by 13 member agencies, all the way from sort of the upstream data providers, the NASAs of the world, to the downstream data users, the Department of Transportation and State Department and so on. The part of the legislation that established USGCRP required a quadrennial national climate assessment. And this is all that the law requires, but it has sprawled into a quite robust enterprise that basically you're told to do three things. Integrate the findings of the program, writ large, whatever that means. Analyze the effects of global change across a variety of sectors here of the American economy, and then to look at trends in global change, both anthropogenic and natural, on multi-decadal and centennial timescales. For the fourth National Climate Assessment, we did this in 2 volumes. You guys probably are familiar with the first volume, the Climate Science Special Report, came out in November of 2017. And then the second version, which is the Impacts, Risks, and Adaptation Report. If you're familiar with the IPCC, these very much mimic Working Group 1 and Working Group 2. If you're familiar with USGCRP, we tend not to get too involved in the Working Group 3 side of the equation, the kind of mitigation piece, although we'll touch on some aspects here. And this chart just basically at a very high level shows the areas of emphasis for the 2 different reports as they were mapped onto the congressional mandate. As I mentioned, the CSSR, as we call it, came out in November of 2017. I would encourage you to check out science2017.globalchange.gov if you haven't already. 15 chapters, 500 pages, roughly 50 or so authors, a mix of feds and non-feds. You know, kind of your standard physical science of climate change report with a focus on the United States, but with a couple of really important advances. A lot of it was on detection and attribution, both of individual events as well as trends writ large. Focus on extreme events. What do we know now about tropical cyclones, tornadoes, and atmospheric rivers, as you can see here, that we didn't know before, and how are they going to evolve in a changing climate? It features a lot of downscaled information. This is, again, what I mentioned early on. The pivot to focus on regional information was driven really by 2 things. One, the fact that the science allows us to go there for one of the first times in NCA history, in a sense, because we have so much more downscaled information, but also because our user communities, the people on the ground that are trying to make decisions in light of a changing climate, are demanding this information. We could have a debate all day long about the appropriate uses of different types of downscaled information, but suffice to say, a lot of it is captured in the CSSR. There's a new chapter at the end on potential surprises, which is really kind of interesting and looks at how different tipping points or thresholds in the Earth system may interact with one another and what that might mean more broadly. And then they also took a novel look at climate model weighting. Please don't ask me to get into the details of it, but suffice to say, there's a an appendix in the back of this that kind of articulates in a bit of detail what they did to basically try to look at whether the outcomes would change by applying a weighting to climate model skill. And long-winded answer is that not really, which is kind of an interesting finding. So this 500-page report was summarized into about a 50-page chapter in Volume 2. And there are a couple of chapters of particular interest to the CMS community, probably. Chapter 2, I'm going to forget a lot of these, but 8 and 10 and 13, these are kind of floods, droughts, and wildfires, terrestrial biogeochemistry, ocean changes. Chapter 14 is the mitigation chapter there, but really the whole report is probably of interest. The focus of this talk, of course, is on Volume 2, the impacts assessment. It was released the day after Thanksgiving, of course. With all of GCRP's reports, we are policy relevant without being policy prescriptive, very similar to the IPCC. Despite what you may have heard by some folks, we assess a range of potential impacts, looking at a variety of scenarios, and also looking at both observed change as well as projected change. And then kind of a couple of kind of new aspects or kind of novel aspects or areas of emphasis, if you will. The regional information I've already hit on a few times. We started to integrate the economic impacts of climate change more than has been done before. This is obviously an emerging area of research, and so there's not a whole lot to assess, but EPA's climate impacts risk analysis, the CIRA work, laid the foundation for a lot of that economic analysis, which you'll find throughout. We also integrate international considerations for the first time. We have a whole standalone chapter on how climate change abroad affects U.S. interests. So whether that means supply chains for American companies, disaster response and humanitarian assistance, national security, transboundary issues, whether it's water in the Southwest or wildfires in the Northwest. We have a concise chapter that tackles all those things. And then finally, we really tried to highlight case studies. We wanted this to, despite what the cover may suggest, be more than just a doom and gloom report, but really highlight, hey, yeah, bad things are happening, but a lot of actions are being taken to address the risks that are facing American society. And so the thinking here is that if you can elevate and give visibility to some of these adaptation actions in particular that are happening at a local level, perhaps other communities will learn from one another and be able to bolster the resilience of the country as a whole. So, as I mentioned, about 30 chapters in Volume 2. This Our Changing Climate is kind of the CSSR component, the physical science piece. A bunch of national topic chapters, followed by the 10 regional chapters, a couple of responses, adaptation, and mitigation, as well as some appendices. The blue chapters are kind of the new chapters compared to NCA 3. The air quality chapter in particular kind of came out of a lot of new work that's been happening at the Climate Air Quality Nexus, and in particular some of the work that came out of the USGCRP Climate and Human Health Report from 2016. I mentioned the international chapter. This sector interactions, multiple stressors, and complex systems is an outgrowth of the Food, Energy, Water Nexus chapter from NCA 3 and really looks at how impacts across sectors can really have unexpected consequences for American society. From the regional side, one thing I'll highlight is sort of pulling out the U.S. Caribbean from the Southeast chapter. This turned out to be quite prescient given the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season, but we now have a whole chapter based on focusing on Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and obviously those areas not only face unique impacts from climate change relative to the coastal Southeast, but also, as we saw, unfortunately, have very unique capacities to respond relative to the mainland as well. And so there's a whole new chapter on that. We also split up the Great Plains chapter along the Kansas-Nebraska border as well. So walkthrough of the overview. Before getting into the actual findings itself, one important thing to note is that we really tried to frame this whole report around a risk-based framework. So by asking kind of the fundamental question, what is it that you value and how are those things that you value at risk from climate change? What are the consequences that you want to avoid? And to do so, we worked with the National Academies to convene a workshop back in, I think, 2016, late 2015 maybe, on characterizing risk in climate change assessments. And I think, you talk to people, you'll say that, we did this to varying degrees of success throughout the report. This is a difficult thing to communicate risk, particularly in a scientific context. If you're interested in this, I would direct you as well to the UK's climate assessment. They actually have done a really good job on this, and we leaned on their assessment quite heavily to inform how to do our own. And when I put up this plot that I'm sure most of you have seen before, looking at carbon emissions basically historically from 1900 through the end of this century under a variety of RCPs. And I put it up there just to kind of demonstrate that, broadly speaking, we told the authors to kind of focus on two scenarios: RCP 4.5, kind of this lower middle scenario, and then RCP 8.5, sort of the higher end scenario. And I try to take care not to call it a worst case scenario, because we don't necessarily know what worst case could be. It's simply the largest one that the modeling community has put out there. And importantly, over the past 10 or 15 years, we've been tracking most closely to that RCP 8.5 scenario. So, when people say, well, who knows, what the future is going to bring, that's true. And so it's important to kind of get a spread of results so we can make informed decisions in light of it. You don't necessarily get car insurance because you expect to get in a car accident, but you might. So you might want to plan for the eventuality that you get into that car accident. And that's kind of the risk-based framework that we try to take on here. And it's important to note that when you do this, you need to be careful in talking about the results, so you don't come across as alarmist and talking about the sky falling and everything, but really talking about that if we're going to plan accordingly and make big investments for resilience, we might want to take into account what some of these large magnitude or fast occurring impacts could be. So if you want to tune out, just read this slide and then kind of snooze or whatever. But basically in 5 bullets, this is all kind of at a very high level. The climate is changing faster than at any point in modern civilization. There was stronger wording here, but that's what the review process is for. These changes are primarily the result of human activities. These impacts are already being felt across the country and pose threats to the way of life across the nation. And the impacts are rising both in magnitude and rate. But as I mentioned, Americans are responding. We are taking action, but the scale, both the magnitude and the rate of response actions in terms of both mitigation and adaptation are not yet at the scale needed to avoid the worst impacts. I won't go into all the details of this slide, but really what we wanted to demonstrate in the overview is to start with, what are the observed changes that we've seen. If you're familiar with USGCRP work at all, we have a big focus on indicators of change, and this is a kind of a brief summary of that. If you go online, this is an interactive graphic that you can play around with a little bit more. But suffice to say, whether you're talking about temperature and precip, water and ice, ocean and ocean or sort of terrestrial changes, we all generally see consistent changes across a number of different discrete indicators that are consistent with our understanding of climate change. What about that attribution of change? Many of you have probably seen plots like this because they're from your colleagues up in New York. But basically, what you see here is the temperature anomaly since the late 19th century. The observed change in black. This panel just shows the natural influences, volcanic, solar, and orbital. And when you sum them up into these natural drivers, you see, not much change over the course of the past century or so. If you look at just human influences, tropospheric ozone, land cover changes, and aerosols, on top of the long-lived greenhouse gases, you see sort of that red line. And when you combine both the human and natural influences, you see a remarkable degree of matching with the observational record. Okay, so we've seen observed change, we've seen the attribution of that change. What are some of the projections that we expect to see? These are kind of high-level maps of temperature changes across the 10 NCA regions of the U.S. For the middle of the century and at the end of the century. And on the left-hand side, in the lower scenario, the 4.5, and in the right scenario, the higher scenario. Two main take-home messages here is that there's a pretty consistent trend of warming regardless of scenario, that it gets worse under a higher scenario, and in particular, that the higher latitude places tend to have even more extreme warming, all fairly well known. On the right now, we've shown projections of precipitation change over. This is at the end of the century under the high scenario, and I chose this just to kind of tease out some of the potential trends in a bit more detail, some of the signal more. And this is seasonal, winter, spring, summer, and fall. And you might not be able to see some of the detail here, but broadly speaking, you can see the brown areas are drier and the green areas are wetter. The hatching indicates areas where there's not a whole lot of trend. The red dots where there's a pretty significant expectation. And generally speaking, wet areas get wetter, dry areas get drier. And really importantly as well, that how this precipitation falls is a big thing, right? We expect to see, and we are already seeing, more frequent, more intense, heavy downpours. So when it does rain, it tends to rain harder, and that has huge implications, obviously, for not only the availability of freshwater resources, but also for flooding and other impacts as well. I mentioned earlier some of the downscaling that's been done. I highlight one particular outcome here are these sea level rise projections that were done by colleagues at NOAA and in conjunction with a number of other folks. They basically downscale global sea level rise projections for a regional outcome, and they account for not just the thermal expansion of water and land-based ice melt, but also vertical land movement, ocean circulation, and some of these other non-climate factors as well. So they're some of the most sophisticated sea level rise projections that we have to date, and they're a really powerful tool, for teasing out some of the regional differences in sea level rise, right? And of course, you see kind of well-known pattern of high vulnerability in the Gulf Coast and along the eastern seaboard, whereas in addition to having traditional sea level rise, you also have tectonic forces and hydrocarbon extraction and other things that are allowing for more compression of that land surface, as opposed to somewhere in the Gulf of Alaska, for example, where you have some of that rebound going on. So after going through sort of the observed change, the attribution of change, and the projection of change in the overview, we then sort of divide the impacts and the responses into three big buckets. We tried to think about how can we summarize all of this material in a brief way, and the best thing we came up with were these three buckets. The first of which was economy and infrastructure. So what are the current and future risks associated with the economy and infrastructure? I won't go through the details of all of this, other than to point out a couple of things. Natural resource-based economies, obviously, a large part of American economy is focused on natural resources, whether it's timber, fisheries, agriculture, other things. And so we highlight a number of kind of response measures. Here you see some native prairie grasses embedded into traditional agriculture to help retain soil and avoid nutrient loss and so on. We also see a lot of vulnerability of our nation's infrastructure. In the bottom here you see a nuclear plant along the Missouri River just north of Omaha. Fortunately, the flooding did not affect the operations to a significant degree, other than having to have it shut down. But it wouldn't take much more, as you can see, to make this a much worse scenario. And of course, you can see the list of potential outcomes here, and they're becoming more and more resonant to the lives of daily Americans, not just these sort of far removed impacts, but if you guys tried to travel to Phoenix last summer, or out of Phoenix or somewhere in the Southwest, you saw, remember, a lot of the Sky Harbor was shut down for some time because the runways were too hot for planes to take off and land. So these impacts are happening more and more. The second big bucket was on natural environment and ecosystem services. This was split up into a lot of different impacts, whether it's safe and reliable water supplies, protection from flooding and erosion, whether it be from mangroves or elsewhere, the vitality of coral reef ecosystems, as well as changes in recreation and subsistence activities. As I mentioned, a big piece of this report was really making the impacts and the response actions resonant to a variety of communities, and we have a large focus on tribes and indigenous communities, and obviously they have a lot of connections to the natural environment and their traditional ceremonies and so on. So you just see razor clamming up in the Northwest, and some examples of coral farming in the Caribbean and Florida, both sort of a traditional recreation activity, which many people outside of the Northwest may not know is actually something to do, as well as some response measures that are trying to address some of the effects of warming, bleaching, acidification, deoxygenation in the Gulf region. And the final bucket of overview findings was on human health and well-being. This builds again on the Climate Change and Human Health report we released in 2016, and looked at obviously a variety of different health outcomes and well-being indicators. High temperatures being the obvious ones. We have a map here of just kind of the cooling centers and hydration stations in Phoenix. Response measures like this are not only going to have to likely expand in the Phoenix area, but also across the U.S. in the future, but also some kind of less intuitive aspects of climate change. We're starting to see a lot of research done on the quality of our food as a result of climate change. What does it mean, for the micronutrient availability and the mental health indicators of climate change? One of the most obvious aspects of this is kind of on the forced dislocation or relocation aspect. Obviously, post-Katrina, you saw a lot of that. And here you see the Isle de Jean Charles in the Mississippi Delta area. And they've basically made the decision to relocate with the help of some federal funds. And there's a big focus in the report, obviously, on kind of participatory decision-making to ensure that communities are bought in and aware of what's going on around them. So all of what I just presented on these different buckets of findings are related through these interconnected systems. I mentioned that new chapter on multiple sectors and complex systems, and the point here is just that all these things are related, both in terms of the linkages within them, but also how impacts from one sector can impact another sector. And just give the example down here that is relevant to the cover of the CSSR report. If you have a wildfire that chars a hillside in California, and then subsequent to that, you have an atmospheric river dumping a ton of rain onto that area. That rain can induce a landslide that cuts off the road, that then cuts off emergency services, economic activity, all that sort of stuff. You see it in Hurricane Florence, what it did to I-95. And you see it oftentimes on the West Coast with I-5 and how serious those disruptions can be. The report concludes with kind of two chapters I mentioned on reducing risks, one through adaptation and the other through emissions mitigation. Really, the adaptation chapter looks at the process for adaptation planning, runs through a 5-stage process of awareness, assessment, planning, implementation, and then monitoring and evaluation. And it's a cyclical or iterative process, so you continue to learn and inform your future decision making. And what we tried to highlight in this chapter was that at the time of the third National Climate Assessment, you saw there was quite a bit, obviously, of awareness and assessment, and we're starting to get some planning and minimal implementation, but it was starting to happen. And now, even just 4 or 5 years later, you're actually seeing fairly significant on-the-ground implementation, which is great. But we're not quite to the stage of really understanding how to evaluate the efficacy of those adaptation actions. And are our investments actually wise ones? And that's a much more difficult and active area of research. I mentioned the integration of economic impacts throughout the report. It was a big focus of the emissions mitigation chapter. The despite what the title may say, this is not necessarily a chapter that focuses too much on different mitigation technologies or things like that. You can look at some of the U.S. government's reports to the UN to get a better sense of that. It's a bit outside of the scope of GCRP to do that, but one of the things we looked at was the CIRA report, the Climate Impacts Risk Analysis from EPA. If you go to epa.gov/CIRA, C-I-R-A, you can take a look at this, and really what it does is look at the impacts of climate change across a variety of sectors of the American economy, both under the RCP 8.5 scenario and under the RCP 4.5 scenario, and look at the cost savings that can be realized through that. Now, this is a course first step at doing this, and so, you know, I think one of the things to take away is just the size, the relative size of these bubbles. Maybe don't look as much at the actual numbers at this stage, but I think it's an important thing to note that labor turns out to have not only a huge impact under a warming world, but also a huge possibility for cost savings or damages avoided under a lower emission scenario. And obviously, if you think about how much of our economy is driven by outdoor workers, whether it's agriculture or construction or otherwise, it's not a surprise to see. There are some more unintuitive results here, and I would encourage you to dig into the CIRA report to understand some of the nuances of the modeling they did. But suffice to say that this is a pretty strong first effort of trying to understand how the impacts of climate change are going to hit us economically. The chapter also looks at mitigation actions across the country at a pretty high level, and one of the key points here is that it's not always federal action that's needed. Obviously that's helpful, but certainly there's a lot going on at the subnational level, whether it's regional, state, local, or otherwise. And so we just have a couple plots here of both state level action as well as the orange dots denoting cities that have basically signed on to different mitigations actions, and then tease that out based on different types of mitigation activities. So whether it's greenhouse gas cap or pricing, or a renewable portfolio standards, or transportation, or other types of state level actions. But again, kind of going back to the fifth bullet of the earlier slide, these are not yet to the scale necessary, certainly not only domestically, but more importantly globally when it comes to mitigation to really avert the worst outcomes from climate change. So I'll now kind of focus briefly on some topics of relevance to the CMS community. These are just the coordinating lead authors and the chapter leads for some of the sectoral chapters that I thought might be of particular interest to the carbon community. And so if you guys ever want to reach out to any of these folks, or let me know, I'm happy to make any connections. But suffice to say, these folks are just the leads. There are dozens and dozens of authors underlying their work as well. And I'm going to focus on just 3 chapters: land cover and land use change, forests, and then oceans and marine resources. And what you'll see is I'm going to focus on sort of the key messages and then some of the remaining uncertainties to kind of tease maybe some future research directions. And where a lot of that information came from is the traceable accounts. If you've dug into the report, that word may sound familiar. If you haven't, it's probably some assessment-related jargon. But what they are is basically a fairly unique component of GCRP assessments that require the author teams to really justify the conclusions they make. So the report is centered around key messages, and then the authors have to sort of justify it with, what is the evidence base for that conclusion, what are the major uncertainties, and things like that. And so you dig into that in a bit more detail at the end of the chapter if you're interested. So I'm going to plead a degree of ignorance on some of these slides because this is not my area of expertise. And for this one, Ben Sleeter and Tom Loveland at GS are the real experts. But the 2 main key messages from the land cover and land use change chapter are that land cover changes influence weather and climate. That's, I think, fairly well understood. And that climate change alters disturbance patterns, species distribution, and the suitability of land for specific uses. And you see here just one graphic from the chapter that looks at the net change in land cover from 1973 through about 2010. And you can see some of the big changes in agriculture in the Great Plains region, and some of the changes in forest cover in the southeast, both from policy changes as well as from climate changes as well. Some of the remaining uncertainties that were revealed in this chapter were that the role of deforestation as a warming agent is still relatively unknown. A couple of more nitty-gritty aspects that they highlight are looking at the sensible and latent heat fluxes in climate models and land surface models, the relationship of albedo to forest density in the presence of snow, and also basically the impact of snow more broadly on albedo. And then one of the other aspects, which is kind of unique from all this, was sort of the impacts of urbanization. This is a growing area of interest for our program more broadly, but in particular, these authors highlighted what does urbanization mean for storm tracks and other precipitation patterns. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out here, not just this plot, but it's a reminder that we also have these integrated climate and land use scenarios, these ICLUS scenarios that EPA and USGS and a number of interagency folks pulled together that look at basically changes in land cover over time. And they're really kind of powerful, and I would encourage folks to take a look. If you just Google ICLUS, you'll come up with them. So next is forests. This is Dave Peterson and Jim Vos up in the Northwest, in the Forest Service led this chapter. And they basically looked at both sort of extreme events and the impacts on forests in the near term, but also sort of the alterations that are occurring over decadal to centennial scales as a result of climate change, and what that means for forest productivity and species distribution in the longer term. They tied it back to sort of what this means for society by looking at the ecosystem services that are provided by forests to society, whether it's carbon storage, timber, recreation, other aspects, and what that means. And then they talk finally about what it means for management activities, and how, as was in the news quite a lot at the end of 2018, what forest management means for the vitality of forests and the communities around them. And obviously here, for those of you that have been out west, the common scene of brown trees from the pine beetle outbreaks is a relatively common sight now. Some of the remaining uncertainties that these authors highlight are sub-regional scale projections of wildfires. Obviously, a big focus of the chapter was on wildfires. The effects of climate changes on both insect species, whether it be pine bark beetles, but other species as well as fungal pathogens, probably something that doesn't get as much press as the pine bark beetle, but certainly probably of growing importance. The impacts on species distribution and abundance is pretty important as well, not just for communities that rely on these things for protection and ecosystem services, but also for the implications for invasives and what that means. You'll see that in the chapter I didn't highlight here on ecosystems and biodiversity. There's a big focus on the role of invasives. And the final one I'll focus on is just oceans and marine resources. I mentioned earlier kind of this triple whammy that's hitting oceans right now. It's probably a quadruple whammy in some sense of kind of the natural aspects of, or the climate aspects of warming, acidification, and deoxygenation. But when you couple that with some of the fishery and other harvest aspects of marine ecosystems, you start to see how threatened some of these sensitive areas are. And it's not just the fisheries themselves, but a lot of the coastal communities that are reliant on them. And this is an aspect that a number of chapters highlighted quite a bit, in particular some of the regional chapters, the U.S. Caribbean, Hawaii, and the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands, and even the Northeast, thinking about sort of the iconic species of lobster and salmon in the Northwest, and how the availability and timing and vitality of these species is at risk, and what it's meaning for management practices in these different regions. And then they also focused on extreme maritime events, and I'll show a graph in the next slide of what some of these have looked like over the past couple of years, whether it was the marine heat wave in the North Atlantic in, I think, 2012-ish, or the blob in the Pacific, the North Pacific in 2014-15-ish, and what that can mean for motivating change. You know, these kind of real near-term impacts can really start to lead to some innovations in terms of monitoring and evaluation and alerts and forecasts and that sort of thing. So this is the plot I was just telling you about, or the graphic I was just telling you about, some of the extreme events. You can dig online into a bit more detail if you're interested. But some of the remaining uncertainties that the authors highlighted here was sort of the rate of adaptation of marine species. This is a common theme throughout the report. You see it quite often. You know, is the rate of climate change outpacing the rate at which species can adapt? And you see this, you know, whether you're in mountain environments and they go higher and higher up the mountain, or if they're in the oceans and they're going either to more northern latitudes or deeper depths. What does that mean, you know, for the communities not only that rely on them from a human standpoint, but also the ecosystems themselves? The interacting stressors, I mentioned this, the warming, acidification, and deoxygenation, marine ecosystems. You know, you see this play out pretty dramatically. Actually, it had some would say a pretty profound impact on the gubernatorial and senatorial elections in Florida with the harmful algal blooms in the coast there. And obviously there are multiple stressors beyond just the climate impacts, but the nutrient runoff and all of that has huge implications for how we manage these systems. And then one of the other things they focus on is how natural modes of climate variability will function in an altered climate. So this idea of non-stationarity and what that means for events like that blob of 2015. So I'll now kind of zoom back out briefly to look at regional information. This, as I mentioned, was kind of the bulk of the report, even though I'm not going to focus on it for this particular talk. But we divided the report, as I mentioned, into 10 regional chapters and on top of the 15 or so sectoral chapters. And we did a pretty extensive public engagement leading up to the publishing of the report. And the idea here was to really go out into the community. We held these regional engagement workshops. The big green dots are the hubs, and then we had satellite locations to try and touch as many places, as many discrete audiences as we could around the U.S. to get a better understanding of what it is that the folks in these regions value, and how those things that they value are at risk from climate change. That was sort of the fundamental aspect. And then the next question, obviously, when you're trying to conduct a science assessment is, okay, well, are you aware of the scientific literature that we should include and assess in our work? The key messages were then framed around those things, and then we also, as I mentioned, kind of highlight options, challenges, opportunities, and importantly, success stories for addressing that climate risk. Again, this is kind of just hitting it home a little bit more about what do different regions value. In the Northeast, this actually is St. Louis, obviously, but urban infrastructure is a big piece. Coastal economies, this is San Juan, Puerto Rico, obviously a huge driver of the economy in Puerto Rico. I believe this is the Marshall Islands. I love this photo. This is basically the freshwater reservoirs in the Marshall Islands, and obviously somewhat susceptible to inundation in a given storm, and just huge implications. For those of us, I know there's probably about 4 or 5 of us that went to grad school in the Northwest, if not more. Outdoor recreation, hiking in the Cascades and the Olympics under a shroud of wildfire smoke becomes an increasingly important occurrence. And the annual salmon runs and how important that is for a lot of tribal communities as well. So a lot of people, when I first took on the position, they said, oh, well, is the National Climate Assessment a decision-making tool or an educational tool? And, I think a lot of people want it to be a decision-making tool. I think historically it's probably succeeded more as an educational and awareness-raising tool. And it certainly can be both. And one of the things we've tried to aspire to do is to make it more of a decision-making tool, in part by giving more of that downscale and localized information, as well as some of the case studies. And so, These slides are taken from Victoria Keener from the East-West Center out in Hawaii and Ellen McCrae from NOAA up in the Northeast. But really what they're kind of highlighting is some of the aspects that they need when they go out and try to use the NCA to inform policymaking and decisions in their regions. It needs to be authoritative, transparent, comprehensive, and inclusive. We like to think that we kind of ticked all those boxes with the NCA. Looking across the 10 regional chapters, you see a lot of common themes. Adaptation actions were a big one, in part because we really emphasized highlighting that aspect. Economy and societal well-being, natural resources, and vulnerable communities. I'll highlight vulnerable communities here just for a second. In particular, if you look at the Northwest chapter, they really framed a lot of their whole chapter around frontline communities and how they are, the first to experience climate change and probably oftentimes the least able to respond to it, and what the implications are for the region as a result. And then finally, this is just a nice image of for those of you that know, Victoria Keener and Chip Fletcher meeting with the mayor of Honolulu a few days after the release of the National Climate Assessment, and basically having informed, they had a very strong pre-existing relationship with local decision makers throughout Hawaii, but it just demonstrates again how cities and states really rely on this type of information to inform some of their decisions, especially folks that aren't like the New Yorks and the Miamis and the Chicagos of the world that have an enormous amount of resources to really address some of these risks. So finally, I'll just kind of touch on two other things. The first, as I mentioned, is the Soccer 2 report. This is the second State of the Carbon Cycle report. The U.S. Global Change Research Program really tries to do sort of or accomplish a sustained assessment process, and one of the ways of doing that is by continually trying to release some of these special report topics. So the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group and the U.S. Carbon Cycle Program obviously deserves enormous credit for pulling this feat off. So if you go to carbon2018.globalchange.gov, you can take a look. It's basically a decadal assessment of carbon cycle science across all of North America, not just the U.S., so it pulls in Canada and Mexico as well. That's all I'll probably say about this right now, but it's a little bit of a teaser for a future talk, perhaps. And then finally, I just want to kind of put a marker out there that planning for NCA 5 is already underway. Whether or not we're ready for it. But I think one of the things we learned after NCA 3 was that if you take some time off and kind of just sit back and don't really think about the assessment for a little while, you lose a lot of time, and then it compresses the timeline. A lot of people think that it's ridiculous that these things take 3-4 years to pull off, but when you get into the weeds and realize that there are 8 iterations of review, that it goes out to the national academies, and that the national academies review has to be externally reviewed in and of itself, you realize just how long these things take. And so we've started an interagency process, a sustained assessment working group. Many of you may have participated in it. If not, and if you're interested, let me know. Happy to engage you guys. But what we've been doing basically over the past year and a half or so is talking about different elements of a sustained assessment process, whether it's evaluation of the report, contributor engagement, user engagement, scenarios, data tools, indicators, all this sort of stuff, and trying to come up with recommendations that we would want to inform kind of not just NCA 5, but the longer-term sustained assessment process. And I'd be remiss if I didn't note that we also now have a confirmed OSTP director in place, Calvin Drogmeyer, who himself is a meteorologist and so has a keen interest and understanding of these issues, is aware. We just briefed him last week, and he's interested in kind of getting underway, and so we now have kind of the pieces of the puzzle we need to kind of move forward and start to chart the path. So if you're interested in learning more about NCA 5, or all the better if you want to get involved, let me know. And with that, we've got some time for questions, but I, again, would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to several hundred of the authors, both feds and non-feds, that contributed to this. So thank you very much.
Now, questions? There's going to be a mic. It's going to be here. anyone who has any questions or questions online, the people on the phone line can also speak up or use the chat box. While we wait, there were a couple of questions here. So Christine Walker, she's asking that you were showing a slide that was showing that it was projected less wildfire damage with climate change. And she thought that more frequent wildfires were predicted with climate change. Talk about that.
Yeah, I believe this is probably the slide she was talking about, which is why I made that caveat at the end, and it's this number down here. I would direct you to the report for more details. There were, I get this question now at multiple talks, and I forget the exact reasoning that the authors gave me, but Jeremy Martinich at EPA is one of the primary authors and can give you a more full-throated response to that. But I believe part of it had to do with the implications for recreation and things like that, and I forget the exact logic train, but if I get your contact information or if you shoot me an email, I'll be sure to get you the full answer.
There are state and local governments who refuse to discuss climate change, even though they should. And then, do representatives for the report try to reach out to them, or only discuss with stakeholders and decision makers who are willing to meet?
No, that's a great question, and I think, you know, as I've made clear, you know, as the director of this whole effort, you know, this assessment exercise did not end with the publication of the report, but all 300 plus authors not only have the opportunity, but I would argue the responsibility to go out and make people aware of what this report is saying, what the risks are, and what it means for society. And so I think, you know, you've seen some regions take that information up a bit more willingly than others, but I think you're starting to see greater penetration of this information. Just in the past last week, there were 2 hearings in the House where the National Climate Assessment featured quite prominently, one of which had, you know, the Republican ranking member came right out and made quite a strong statement about, you know, the urgency of climate science and why we need to take action. So you're starting, I think, to see a lot of people pivot. You know, with any issue, it's an evolution, and I think hopefully by framing our work in terms that matter to people, you know, whether it's the economic implications or what it means for your kids being able to practice soccer in the summertime for 2 hours in the middle of the day, you know, those things start to resonate with people, and then you start to hopefully make some inroads.
So thank you. Sure. Oh, wow. I was just wondering if GCRP has any interaction with the disaster response sort of framework of the federal government. And what I'm thinking about is instances where we have natural disasters that seem to be amplified by climate change. And then cities, towns get funding to fix the infrastructure. But they don't get funding to improve the infrastructure to respond to a larger flood or a bigger fire, you know, whatever. Mm-hmm. So is there any interaction between GCRP and those other agencies?
This couldn't have been a better timed question. Just last week, we briefed the Subcommittee on Disaster Reduction, which is a sister subcommittee of the Subcommittee on Global Change Research, without bogging you down in government bureaucracy. They're sort of sister subcommittees that are chaired by folks at USGS and their Natural Hazards Division, and folks at DHS and FEMA and elsewhere. I think it's the beginning of a longer-term conversation, hopefully. I think one of the things we saw there was a real resonance with some of the things that we're showing, and a recognition in particular after 2017 and after 2018. You know, NOAA just last week released their $1 billion disasters report for 2018. that had some fairly stark numbers in it. And I think, we as a program have also started to think about, are there lessons learned or best practices we can identify in the aftermath of a disaster, post-disaster recovery, for example, and working with the Subcommittee on Disaster Reduction to try and pull that out, in particular looking at, what's been going on in Puerto Rico, for example, and some of the contrast between what's going on there and say, in Houston and things like that, and what does that mean? So, I think you're starting to see some of that. What happened in Houston post-Harvey is a really interesting example, right, where you had, I apologize if I get some of the details of this wrong, but there were some local changes to some of the zoning as a result, because of the flood vulnerability, but I believe then some of that got overturned, and you start to see some of the forces at play here, right? And I think you have real implications that you need to deal with, whether when you start talking about a local community's tax base and what that means for development and things like that, and smart development and recovery. So, long-winded answer, but the answer is that we're starting to, and if you have additional connections you think we should make, by all means, let me know. Back.
How are you folks dealing with the sort of social psychology aspect of things, in that, if you care about the planet, or even if you don't, this is a sad message, it's a scary message. People just want to put their head in the sand and keep doing what they're doing. So how do you you can't paint a rosy picture, but how do you put a positive spin on this so that people just don't want to run away from the information?
Yeah. A couple ways I'll answer that. The first is, one of the ways we tried to frame this report, as I mentioned from the start, was not purely as an impacts report, right? And so, when you do that, we still got pressure through various review cycles to say, not all the impacts are going to be negative, and that's true. Some regions and some aspects over some time frames may benefit. But importantly, that there are things that we can do to, bolster our resilience and to build our ability to adapt to these things. In the U.S., we're fortunate. We, have a heck of a lot more resources than most places in the world to kind of address some of these risks, and I think that's one of the things that has to give us hope. I went to my undergrad alma mater a couple of weeks ago to give a talk, and it's a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, and it's a very, in some sense, isolated community, but there is so much great stuff going on there just to build an incredibly sustainable environment right there, right? And that's a very isolated, very localized thing, but it's happening, right? And so, if given, the motivation, if people are given the messages in a way that, hopefully resonates and shows them that not only can they be cost effective, but they can improve your life as a result, hopefully you can start to get some positive receptivity. Yeah. The other piece I'll say is that, more broadly speaking, as a program, we have a social sciences coordinating committee, and they basically look at all aspects of social science across the global change spectrum. And one of the other aspects that we encouraged authors to incorporate throughout the report are social science considerations, and obviously that plays a big role when you're talking about adaptation planning and participatory governance and that sort of thing. And so you'll see that in a lot of chapters. And to their credit, the Social Science Coordinating Committee has also started to hold some focus groups with a number of our authors, and to see how they felt social sciences were integrated into their chapters and whether there were opportunities for improvement and so on. So I think it's certainly an area that we recognize as important and that we can certainly improve in the scientific assessment world.
Any other questions? Any other questions on the phone line? This is just 1 p.m. So thank you, David.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you for the people that are online, and we have maybe like for people that want to stay here, there's coffee here, and we can chat with David.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.